Angry MGTOW here. Today I have Nicholas H Wolfinger, Nick, here, and we're going to be discussing marriage versus MGTOW. Nick's longtime collaborator, Bradford Wilcox, last year published a video for PragerU and then also a rebuttal on The Economist, basically discussing the benefits of marriage. He ultimately had a run-in with a guy named Turd-Flinging Monkey that many of us are aware of. And I will say that it doesn't appear that that the two of them are the best of friends. Earlier this year, Nick published an article that appeared on medical research website. It also was picked up by Science Daily and also various places in the media, ranging from Ask Men to, I believe, CBS and NBC. So it's received a lot of coverage.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, you caused a lot of trouble for us.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't want trouble. I just wanted dialogue.
So what ended up happening is I looked at the article. I looked at his research response, and I basically critiqued it. And then afterwards, I reached out to him, and we were able to come to a consensus that we would go ahead and discuss the statistics a little bit further, whether or not marriage is actually valid versus the MGTOW lifestyle. So I take it, Nick, you do know what MGTOW quite well is at this point.
I wouldn't say know quite well, but I know something about it.
Okay, we're not getting married, having children, and focusing on ourselves.
Right. So yeah, I definitely knew marriage is rejected. I don't know exactly. Are some people refusing to have any contact with women at all in MGTOW?
There are some people who do that, but that's not a tenet of MGTOW. The basic philosophy of MGTOW is we're just not getting married because we're going to get screwed in divorce court. We're not having children, at least not the traditional way, right. And we're focusing on ourselves and our own happiness. But we will still date. We'll still have relationships.
Okay.
That's pretty much it.
Okay. Will the relationships, now I've read a little, do the relationships look like pump and dump, or are they, more ongoing?
So most MGTOWs admittingly do say that you should just pump and dump. However, there are some MGTOWs who do engage in more consistent relationships. A belief in MGTOW, though, is that you should not cohabitate, and you typically should not get into a long-term relationship because that becomes the equivalent of being married.
Right. Okay, I understand. So will anyone who's not MGTOW be watching this podcast? Should we define some of these terms like pump and dump? I'm just thinking.
Okay. You're asking if I can define pump and dump.
Oh, yeah. I'm just thinking if we end up getting the most eyeballs possible on this podcast, we should, define terms like that.
Okay, so pump and dump is essentially, I never thought I'd be defining pump and dump. Pump and dump is essentially where a man meets a woman and he only has the intention of having sex with her and then disengaging in any type of relationship. So he has no interest in a long-term relationship with her. He just finds her, has sex with her, and then gets in, gets out.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so now the original article, let me just see if I can jump to it. We were basically talking about the benefits of marriage, and you were essentially saying that married men have better sex, married men make more money, and there were a bunch of other factors. But the thing is, one, married men live longer. One of the biggest problems that I raised with that is that married men don't necessarily live longer than their single peers. In fact, we have statistics that actually show that divorced men actually fare worse than both married men and single men.
By single, men who never get married, right? Men
who never got married in the first place.
Oh, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Angry.
Okay, so yeah, they're more likely to commit suicide. They're more prone to accidental deaths. There's significant implications that occur after a man has been divorced. And you have to consider these factors when they toss divorced men back into the same category as never married men.
Oh, you're right, totally right. They're different in every way. They're different economically, different psychologically, socially. You're totally right about that. There's a big difference between men who've been divorced and men who've never been married.
Yeah.
Social science is very clear on that point. You're totally right.
Okay. So, I mean, looking at this research, even though they say that, well, married men are happier than single men, or men who've never been, or men who are divorced, it still doesn't have anything to do with their life expectancy, and still doesn't explain a higher suicide risk. Again, it ultimately comes down to the factor that divorced men, that statistic of divorced men will pull down the life expectancy rate of never married men.
You're totally right. You're totally right. And research. That's why research distinguishes between men who've never been married and men who've been divorced. No, you're totally right about that. I wouldn't. Yeah, as someone. Oh, by the way, just for the benefit of the listeners, who am I? Should I say who I am aside from the author of the article?
Oh, sure. Go ahead and give us a little background on yourself as well.
So I'm a sociologist by training. I received my PhD in sociology about 20 years ago. And since then, I've been a professor at the University of Utah, primarily based in an interdisciplinary family studies department with an admittedly funny sounding name, which some of your listeners pointed out, and an adjunct professor of sociology. And I've written a bunch of articles in scientific journals and several books. And I study marriage and divorce. Good enough?
Question for you, though. Yeah. Are you married or divorced?
Oh, that's a good question. And I have two responses. The first response is it fair to ask me that question? If I studied ancient Rome, would you say ask if I was a 2,000-year-old zombie? If I studied you see my point, right? If you were interviewing me and I was studying insects, would you ask me if I was actually a ladybug? So I always find the question slightly troubling on the grounds of, do I have to have personal experience to study something? And but now I'll answer the question. And the answer is, yeah, I'm divorced. I've been divorced 10 years. Totally happy being divorced. I have no kids. Good enough?
No, it's perfectly fine. And I do have to respectfully scratch my head, because you have a happily married divorced guy here talking about the benefits of marriage.
I didn't say I'm happily married divorced guy. I'm happily divorced.
Happily divorced. That's what I meant to say. You're a happily divorced guy, and you're talking about the benefits of marriage. I'm scratching my head on this.
But why does my personal experience have to inform what I study? People, I constantly hear people say, God, no one I know likes Trump. How could he possibly win? Or Hillary is such a corrupt bitch. How is it that anyone supports her? And the answer is, we have to see what Americans in general are interested in. What are the general trends? And to that end, just because I'm not married doesn't mean that there aren't other men who are benefiting from marriage. My personal experience is meaningless. I'm just one guy, right?
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at the statistics, we find that 42% of first marriages end in divorce, and those are rather insane statistics. And most marriages are initiated by the woman.
Most divorces are initiated by the woman.
Most divorces are initiated by the woman.
Yep.
Okay. So the statistics suggest that men who are divorced don't realize much of their investment, meaning their wives take them to the cleaners. They'll lose significant amounts of money in divorce court. plus there may be alimony payments, and there may be child support. And the study then points out that all the things that men should, that basically explains things that men should do to avoid getting divorced, which is rather insane. For example, going to church, not drinking, basically maintaining.
No. We wouldn't tell anyone not to drink. God, no.
Don't become alcoholics.
Yeah, exactly. If you smoke bud, don't become a total burnout who's high 24 hours a day, and so on.
Here's the thing. This puts the liability entirely on the man and suggests that the man is basically always working harder to maintain the marriage.
No. That's true we were just writing in this case about men, but that's equally true for women, and it's also true for men and women who are in same-sex marriages. That's true for all that stuff is true for everyone.
Again, the article specifically called out men.
Yeah, we were talking about men just because of the online exchange between Brad Wilcox and Turd Flinging Monkey. So that's why in this case we're speaking just to men. But in the book Brad and I published last year, we're talking about both men and women. So yeah,
okay. Now
good point. It's not just men's responsibility.
Okay, so it's not just, you're right, it's not just men's responsibility, but don't forget at the same time, we have a lot more to lose, so we end up having to take more of the initiative to preserve that marriage. We have more incentive for that marriage to survive.
I'm not sure men have more to lose. What's your evidence for that?
Well, if you look at divorce courts, men are more likely to lose their assets in divorce court than women are. That is something that we do know. Okay,
well, so the reason that is the men are much more likely to be the primary wage earner and to have produced more money. However, you might also want to balance that by the fact that divorce typically leaves women impoverished. It's much more likely to leave women poor than men poor. And I've done research along those lines, and there's endless studies that show that men tend to be okay financially after divorce, but the women tend to be hurt hard. And it makes sense, right? If the man was the primary wage earner, the woman is going to not have had a job all the time she was married. She's more likely to have primary custody of the kids. And so the divorced women are much more likely to be poorer than divorced men. However, that's if we look at money. But if we look at social outcomes, the men are much more likely to suffer emotionally, psychologically from the divorce than the women.
Now, there's something interesting in this, because actually when you look at statistics, and I don't have it in front of me, when you've looked at statistics, this is something that we know. Children who grow up in single father household, in households where there's a single mother versus where there's a single father, the children who grow up in a single mother household are more likely to end up in prison versus being raised by a single father.
Okay, that's one study, and there's been exhaustive reviews of studies over time, and indeed my own work, that shows that it doesn't really affect kids whether the custodial parent is the man or the woman. It just doesn't make much difference.
Okay, so you're saying that a child is just as likely to end up in jail if they have a single father versus a single mother, despite
absolutely.
Evidence doesn't suggest that.
Yeah, there's a ton of studies. Now, there's an older study, but I don't see why it would have changed, published in the late 90s by Douglas Downey and Brian Powell, which looked at like 50 different consequences of parenting. I'm getting a lot of on your end all of a sudden.
Okay, I'll just mute that.
A lot of different outcomes, kids, how much schooling kids complete, their mental health, all that shit. And it shows that there's no consistent differences between being raised by a single mother and a single father. It just doesn't matter. My own work has shown the same thing. When I've looked at, kids' marital behavior, which is affected by whether their parents got a divorce, it does not matter. whether the parent was a mother or father.
Well, as you said, there's not a lot of consistent research on this because in most cases it's the mother who gets sole custody of the child.
But that doesn't mean just because it's usually the mother doesn't mean there isn't a lot of research on it. It's a reasonable question to ask, right? There are some, most research shows there's no differences. There are a few studies that show that kids raised by single fathers do better. And the reason makes sense, right? If the mother is by default the custodial parent, and I think that's an unfair assumption, but that's how the world has often worked. If the father gets custody, he's especially likely to be a really good dad or a really shitty mother. And so, of course, kids who have good dads are going to do better. Makes sense? So sorry, I know people want clear answers, and that point is a little complicated. But in general, I think the kids are probably not a big gender difference depending upon the parent. But if there is one, probably kids do better if they're raised by the father. And the other reason is the father is more likely to have money than the mother, just because the father is more likely to have worked consistently. Make sense, Angry?
I'll take it.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the University of California, Riverside conducted a study examining marital status and suicide within the previous completed national longitudinal mortality study and found that divorced men are at a greater risk of suicide than married men and women. And divorced and separated persons were over twice as likely in comparison to married persons to commit suicide. More specifically, the risk of suicide among divorced men was over 2 times as likely as that of married men, whereas in women, there was no statistical difference in married and divorced women.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So in other words, when a woman gets married and then divorced, her risk of suicide doesn't increase regardless if she's married or divorced. But when a man gets married and then divorced, he's 2 times more likely to commit suicide than a man who had never been married.
Yeah, I totally believe it. That's consistent with all the studies I've seen. You want me to tell you why I think that's true?
Go ahead.
When men get married, they tend to outsource arranging their social lives to their wives, right? They count on their wives to set up, set up social events of other people. Men tend to not hang out with their single male friends as much, where women hang out more with their single women friends when they're married. So that leaves men more socially isolated when they get divorced. They typically men put too many eggs in that basket. So men end up, once they're divorced, much more isolated. The other reason is that take a lot of the stuff, it takes just to feel okay, right? Eating decent meals, regular meals, that kind of stuff. The woman is much more likely to do that. And so once the man gets married, there's been endless jokes about this in movies and TV. The man doesn't know how to boil a fucking egg, right? So, yeah, and that's, so anyhow, that's, I think, why many divorced men have a much worse mental health than divorced women. So typically after divorce, men's mental health suffers while women's financial health suffers after divorce.
Okay, well, keep in mind that, you're speaking more so of overall, but at the same time, men do suffer financially as well.
They do, they do, because suddenly you went from what's probably a 2-earner household where you get to share the same cable subscription, you get to share the same power bill, you got to share a lot of expenses. You benefited from economies of scale, and then you lose those economies of scale.
What about lifetime alimony? What about child support? What about men losing significant amounts of money versus never being married before?
Okay. Okay, let me take those on point by point. Alimony is pretty uncommon these days. It's just not awarded very much, and the reason is the courts presume that women can work. Child support is awarded, but a couple of comments. First of all, most Americans don't have that much money. Median family income is still hovering around $52,000 a year, and that is income for both families, and that figure is looking at income both for married couples and single people. So a lot of times it's not like the men have these big stock portfolios that the women are getting. That's only a few people. That's not the average American. Most Americans don't have a lot of assets.
That's an excellent point. Most Americans don't have a lot of assets. So that goes on to the child support. Yeah. So when men are getting cleaned out by child support, because let's not forget that women don't pay taxes on child support, men pay the taxes.
Okay.
So when men are basically paying large amounts in child support, they don't have large amounts of assets, because a typical American doesn't have large amounts of assets.
Yeah.
When they're basically paying out all this money in child support, and let's not forget that when a divorce occurs, usually the woman keeps the house, but for the sake of the children, right? And the man basically has to find a house he has to find a home for himself. He has to provide food for himself. Plus, he also has to pay child support. I mean, these things really do drain a man's income.
No, they do. They absolutely do. Yeah. Every time a friend tells me they're getting divorced, my reaction is always, congratulations, I'm sorry. Right? Congratulations, because maybe that means they got out of a bad marriage, but I'm sorry because it's expensive and it's a big transition. Right? So, but I sort of questioned the bigger point, like talking about marriage only by talking about divorce is almost like talking about life, only focusing on the fact that we're all going to die, right?
Right.
You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's focusing relentlessly on the worst outcome. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on divorce, because as you point out, 42 or 43% of marriages will end in divorce. But I don't think we can understand marriage just by focusing on the marriages that don't make it.
Let's talk a little bit about sex very quickly.
Hell yeah.
All right. So unmarried cohabitating men and women have 10% more sex than married men. Yeah. At least initially, not accounting for the duration of the relationship. Yeah. Single men might have less sex than both, but many single men don't have sexual partners at all. So the quantity of sex actually declines with marriage. Wait,
the quantity of sex, you're saying?
Quantity of sex. So basically, the longer a couple is married, the longer a couple is in a relationship, yeah, the less sex they have.
Okay, yeah, I know if that's true. If you look at the beginning of a relationship to say 5 years in, but I don't know if that's true if you look at a relationship between 5 and 10 or 10 and 20 years. I just don't know.
Okay. Well, I'm citing the research that you actually provided when you sent that over.
Okay. So let me say what we're talking about there. Let's compare three categories of men. Single men, or men who don't have live-in girlfriends. Men who are cohabiting with their female partners, and married men. And the reason the cohabiting men who aren't married have more sex than the married men is the cohabiting men are probably just started that relationship more recently. And in a newer relationship, you're always going to have more sex because you're more excited. It's new. But the married men having more sex than the unmarried men got a sex partner in your house. Okay.
Okay. All right, so we have that. Now let's. So I mean, we covered. So we did cover a lot. We basically have concluded that for one, life expectancy. We can conclude that divorced men, they have a lower life
Oh,
expectancy, and
absolutely.
those divorced men are pulling down the statistics when they're added into the column with never married
Oh
men.
yeah, you're right. But we shouldn't do that. That's bad
Okay.
research if you combine the two.
Okay. And now when it comes down to married men make $16,000 more than single men. However, I do argue that that is likely because they are working extra hours, and furthermore, the increase in income is going to be offset by the cost of a family and children. We all know that women make 85% of consumer purchases worldwide, while men pay between 75 and 80% of all income taxes worldwide. That's a statistic, that's a fact.
Okay.
And arguing that they are all at home that all the purchases women make are solely for the home is a bit ridiculous. Women waste considerable amounts of money on clothing, accessories, and decor, and things that are unneeded. While the typical married man might have three times the assets, two to three times the assets of a single man, because that's something that was cited in the
Yeah.
in this thing that you sent me. Don't forget that these assets are often linked to considerable amounts of debt, specifically real estate, and he's paying a significant portion of his income over the course of his life to pay off a home. A married man is more likely to purchase a home if he's married, because he's going to have a wife and children. He's going to be looking for stability and to probably put down roots. So those assets are also linked heavily to debt. We do have to talk about that.
Okay. Okay. You raise interesting points. I'm getting that echo again.
Okay, I'll just pause it. Go ahead.
Okay. So you raise interesting points, and about the the amount of consumer purchases women are making versus men. I don't know it. I don't know that research, so I'm not going to talk about it. You don't seem to know more about it than me, and I don't want to bullshit and talk about things that aren't within my area of expertise. One assumption you make, though, is you talk about her expenses, his assets. Most married couples are pooling their assets. And so I don't know if it always makes sense to talk and their debt for that matter. So I don't know about the extent to which it makes sense to talk about her expenditures, his assets. That's the first point. The second point is that housing debt, you see it as a bad thing, or you seem to have implicitly framed housing debt as a bad thing. But housing debt is very advantageous. Has a lot of tax benefits, right? You get huge tax write-offs. I get big tax write-offs.
You talked about earlier in the stream that the average American doesn't have a lot of resources. They're not making as much money anymore. And you do have to factor in that the cost of housing has increased substantially. I remember last year, I think we're all familiar with the Brady Bunch.
Huh.
The actress who played Cindy Brady, she purchased a beach home in 1968 for $55,000. She sold it in 2016 for over $3 million. This just represents the massive increase in the cost of housing over the last couple of decades. The problem is that when you adjust for inflation, the cost of housing significantly outpaces the increases in earnings for Americans, undoubtedly. So to actually say that there are many benefits to owning a house, the incentive is simply not what it once was. And statistically, most young people, most millennials, will never actually own homes because of changing demographics in the United States.
Okay, you're absolutely right. But I would distinguish between coastal property, especially on the East Coast and the West Coast, which has gone through the roof, to the majority of American housing, which is in the interior, which has seen, which hasn't seen those skyrocketing prices. I think just to suggest that anyone Brady in any coastal house in LA or Malibu is representative of American housing and the housing economy in general is misleading.
Well, I can see exactly what you're saying. Keep in mind, it's a national issue, though. The cost of housing has gone up so substantially that it's really out of reach for most millennials, especially as boomers are buying more properties to turn millennials into renters. So that is a factor that you have to consider.
Oh, yeah. I'm not an economist. We're getting that again. I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert in housing. But traditionally, at least, rates of over the last 60 years, rates of home ownership among Americans have stayed reasonably high. So I'm not certain that I'm going to presume that most millennials will never own property. Wow, we're really getting off topic.
Okay. Well, I mean, here's the thing. Getting back onto topic, because this is why I brought it up. Think about this. Married men, they say, make $16,000 more than single men.
Yeah.
Right? But that's not accounting for the number of hours worked. So that's not saying that they're likely to be more successful. It's highly possible that these men are working longer hours. In fact, it mentioned that I don't know if it was the article or if you mentioned that these men are also likely working a second job. They have a second source of income as well.
That wasn't me.
That was the article. They typically have a second source of income. So basically, unmarried.
Hold on. That second source of income means their wives, not their second job.
Okay. Well, again, it does. Okay, so that's what that was. But again, it says that married men make $16,000 more. So again, they're like, so if that second source is their wives, then that means that they're likely working harder. They're working more hours to make that $16,000 a year. Because it's not suggesting that they're better educated or all these other factors. It's just
they are. Marriage now is highly correlated with having a 4-year college degree. That was not the case 4 years ago. But just as income inequality is affecting all Americans, it's also affecting marriage.
Okay. The point is that even if a man is making $16,000 or more per year, and yes, there are shared living expenses occurring in a relationship, let's not forget that the woman is also going to want things in a relationship as well. And don't forget that children do cost money.
I know.
Okay.
Yeah, according to the census, they cost over $10,000 a year each on average.
There we go. So when you consider these added costs, even if a man is making, let's say, $56,000 a year who's married versus an unmarried man making $40,000 a year, the unmarried man could potentially still have way more disposable income if he's hasn't invested in property, so he may not be paying a mortgage, or he doesn't have children to support, so his money is not being spent on those children.
Right.
So again, that's 16,000. He's essentially, a married men potentially are working harder, longer hours, and but have less disposable income.
Oh yeah, no, I totally take your point, right? I mean, I don't have kids. It was not my personal inclination to pay for them. How about you? You have kids, Angry?
No kids.
Okay, fine. So I don't want kids. But the bottom line is that most Americans do want kids.
Okay.
Yeah, and most people, you ask over and over again, every survey says that the vast majority of people want kids, men and women alike. And in fact, the majority want much kids at some point in their lives. We're back to that echo thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's, I don't know if it's on your side or mine. Anyhow, so most people will want kids. So yeah, there's more disposable income, but suppose you have kids, since if you are the men of MGTOW are talking about not having kids or having kids, under a non-traditional arrangement, what's that going to look like if they have kids under a non-traditional arrangement?
Well, first, I mean, in a non-traditional relationship, MGTOW who do want to have kids, we've talked about using surrogates to have children, where we essentially remove the woman from the entire process, and we would use a surrogate just for the sole purpose of having children with obviously proper legal framework in place.
Has anyone done that?
I mean, we've heard stories about that. Has anyone in the MGTOW community that I personally know done it? No, but I'm sure that there's some men out there who have pulled it off.
Oh, it's of course it's theoretically possible, but there seem to be so many barriers to doing that I'm sure very few men have gone that route, which is maybe why you haven't heard any stories about the men of MGTOW doing so. Right.
Well, keep in mind that a lot of MGTOWs also find having children to be something that's extremely expensive, and we see it as more of a liability. So many of us don't want to have children in the first place at all.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Personally, I've never wanted kids, but that's again, most men do seem to want kids.
Something I do want to bring up, and you may say that you can completely disagree with me if you want to, but the thing about research is that when you look at research, we don't often talk about why researchers conduct specific research.
Right.
Why research? What motivates a researcher?
Okay.
And what typically, in my own studies, it often says, why does a researcher choose to cover a specific topic? And in the books I've read, it says, well, it can be for something personal in their lives. It can be that their own self-interest.
Yeah.
Now, in your case, and you can see where I'm going with this a little bit.
Yeah.
It's I understand the perfect example that you presented, but there does come such a thing as personal experience.
Right.
So I can go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I'll respond to that. There are certainly some people whose research is motivated by their own experiences. I have an unusual record of studying things that have absolutely no relationship to my own life. My first book was about the consequences of growing up in a divorced family. I'm not from a divorced family. My most recent book is about religion. Not religious. The book before that is about gender equity among higher education faculty, and in particular, how family poses problems to women who become professors or scientists, and I'm not a woman. Although I'm sure someone in the comments on this YouTube will suggest otherwise. So yeah, I have no personal stake in these things. I have no financial stake in it, for that matter. It's not like professors are rich. It's not like we ever get that much money from anyone.
I would like to pose a question to you.
Sure.
And I hope that you'll answer. Are you a feminist? Do you consider yourself a feminist, even without the label itself, within the so-called very principle of the word? Would you call yourself a feminist?
Okay, I think that word has become, I'll answer it, but I think that word has become debased in recent years. And I think that's because there are conflicting definitions of feminism. would say very strongly I'm a second wave feminist. I would say equally emphatically that there's much about third wave feminism that is troubling, that I reject categorically.
Okay,
No,
but in terms of,
that positions me without me, without me even trying. That sort of aligns me with some conservative people like Christina Hoff Sommers. I believe Milo's attacks on feminism were, have largely been on third wave feminism. I'm not saying I'm aligned with either of those people or condoning either of those people or endorsing their politics. I'm just saying that my feminism, I share their antipathy towards third wave feminism.
Okay, let me pose this question to you then. So I want to separate.
Can I finish?
Go ahead.
I just don't want to make the assumption that everyone hearing this podcast knows the difference between second wave feminism and third wave feminism. By second wave feminism, I mean simply equal opportunities in society, financially, professionally, socially, politically, for men and women. That is second wave feminism.
Second wave feminism, okay. Your definition of second wave feminism and my interpretation of second wave feminism was about attaining equal representation from a social and economic perspective. Do you agree with that?
Equal representation?
Essentially equal outcome. In other words, for example, women being represented equally in universities. For example, for example, women wanted to have the same amount of women, at least the same amount of girls going to college as the same amount of boys.
That seems to have been successful.
Well, yeah, more than successful. The thing is that second wave feminism, the way you defined it, you defined it as equal opportunity, but for many feminists, it was defined as equal representation or equal outcome. In other words, they see equal opportunity and equal outcome as the same thing.
Okay.
So which one are you on? Because that's important.
Okay. I'm going to disappoint you by not giving you a totally clear answer. And the reason I'm hedging is because you raised a very good point, by the way. Let me commend you on that. The reason is that once you start talking about equality of outcomes, you have to start questioning how that's attained, right? How that is actually accomplished. And that's something I'm not willing to endorse universally, but I am willing to endorse selectively. And the reason I say that is because if you start to talk about equality of outcomes, you have to consider existing structures that produce existing outcomes. So I'm most familiar with this. I'm most familiar with this in some of the Supreme Court decisions in the 70s and some of the ways that affirmative action sought to be implemented, and how rigid implementation of equality of outcomes often produced problems for the existing stakeholders. But I won't categorically reject it either, because there are some cases it may be desirable. It's a very nuanced, hedged response that will make everyone unhappy.
Yeah, they're probably going to leave comments about that. But...
Oh yeah. Feel free. All I'm saying is I don't think these decisions can necessarily be reduced to either all outcomes or all opportunity. But let me ask this. Are you a supporter of the idea of equality of opportunity?
Yes.
Okay. Does that make you a feminist, George?
No.
Why?
Because if you look at the textbook definition of feminism, again, they define it as equal. They're talking about equal representation on the same grounds as men. I mean, if we go to Google,
okay,
and we say, what is feminism?
No, but that's Google.
Okay? The advocacy of women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes, and essentially women being on the same social and economic grounds as men, essentially attaining the same amount as men. So equal opportunity and equal outcome, that's why I brought it up before.
Oh, yeah.
Those are two very different things.
Oh, yeah, I don't deny for a second that those are totally different things.
So my point is this: should every woman have the right to apply to a university? Yes. Should there be gender quotas to suggest that at least 50% of the student body has to be women? No. And you can see the hypocrisy in it today, because if there were far fewer women in universities than men, they would say that there was a problem. But now that there are far more women in universities than men, they say that that's progress.
Who's the they?
Again, I'm feminist.
Again, it's such a broad label, right? It's such a broad label that it has become virtually meaningless. I would suggest too, in some circles, just your support for the equality of opportunity would make you a feminist. It would make you a feminist among people who are more traditional, who saw more traditional social roles for men and women, who thought that certain opportunities should only be available to men because that accords with traditional structures in society, right?
But we both know that feminism, in what it's defined as, and the way it plays out in society today, are two very different things.
Okay, yeah, but one reason that is because everyone has a different definition, right? I've just said it is equality of opportunity and selectively equality of outcome. Selectively, right?
Okay.
I'm not for a second going to suggest that the NFL, you're required to have equality of gender outcome.
Okay. All right. So here's my question that I touched on earlier. I had a question. I said I wanted to ask about Nick versus the researcher. So you versus the researcher, your personal opinion versus your research-based opinion. If someone came to you and said, I'm thinking about getting married, yeah, what do you suggest? From a personal, I want to know what you would say from a personal standpoint versus from a research standpoint. So,
okay,
go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so this is why I am so much fun at weddings, because I can tell you, demographically at least, the characteristics that make marriage more likely or less likely to be successful. Certainly, I could tell them, based on the research, whether their marriage was, demographically predisposed to succeed. But of course, we don't make decisions that way. When was the last time you had dessert, Angry? Cake, ice cream, that kind of thing.
Last night.
Okay. Yeah, dessert is great. And I eat it, even though it's not objectively good for me. It may make me happy, but it's not good for my health or my fitness. And so we tend to evaluate, that came out wrong. It's not a rational calculation when we're, just figuring out who we fall in love with or who we want to get married to. So I could tell you demographically who's likely to stay married. You know, people who marry in their late 20s or early 30s, people who have more education, people who aren't from divorced families, people who choose spouses that are very similar to them on demographic characteristics. All of these things increase the likelihood of staying married. Now, are we ever going to choose a spouse that way? Of course not. So that having been said, if you look at the personal characteristics, I would tell them, I would, depends upon how well I know them. It depends the kind of answer I give them. Did I hedge too much? So I would do so. I think personally, it would be, depending upon how well I know them, I think I would make a case by case basis. I wouldn't universally endorse it.
Let's say you didn't know anything about these people. Let's say you just met someone right off the bat, and they're basically looking at your own personal experience. They want to know, based on your personal experience as Nick, I'm not the researcher, who's been divorced, would you recommend marriage based on your experience? How would you respond?
Because I have many happily married friends. I also, so on that basis, I would encourage it.
On the basis of your happily married friends, what about on the so you would not take your personal experiences into account as being a divorced man?
I would take some responsibility for my own divorce. I wouldn't take all responsibility for it. But I would certainly realize why I should be, why perhaps I made a poor choice in the first place. So I'm not going to blame my ex. She remains one of my best friends. So I'm not going to talk shit about her. I would, I would balance my own responsibility and hers in that decision.
Okay. All right. So I think we covered a lot of grounds today. We were able to at least come to some middle ground. And major thing that I definitely wanted to touch on, and the fact that you agreed with me right off the bat exponentially, is the fact that the research was skewed when it came down to married men, divorced men, and men who are never married. And the fact that divorced men.
That's not making the research skewed. That's simply saying that in order to properly understand the world, you have to separate them into those categories.
Right. So in other words, the research is not properly conclusive. You can't prove that there's a non-spurious relationship between the two because you have divorced men being grouped with single men.
Wait, who are you talking about? Me?
No, I'm talking about the research.
Wait.
Divorced men being placed with single men.
Wait, what's the research? Whose research is that?
The article that your research methodology, we talked about it earlier in the video, that divorced men were categorically grouped with single men. They were counted as single men.
Okay. Can I look say I'll tab out of this to see exactly what I wrote, because I don't have it in front of me and I write a lot of things.
Okay.
Is that going to kill the feed if I don't tab out of this?
No, it's not going to kill anything.
Is this much fun for your listeners? Is this live, by the way, or is this going to be edited?
This is 100% live.
Oh, good shit. All right. Why don't I leave it? I can't remember what I wrote because I wrote a lot, but yeah, your point is absolutely right. Why don't we just leave it at that? You're totally right. You cannot, for many of these outcomes, never married men and men who are divorced are going to look very different. No, yeah, you're totally right about that.
Okay, awesome. So, I mean, one thing I will say is we're nearing the end of the stream. We've been on for about an hour right now. I think that this definitely went a lot better than the turf-fleeing monkey and between, you know, we got along a lot better than TFM and Brad. Well, I mean, maybe they should have just done something like this, had a little sit down.
Well, you know, Brad and I are great friends. We've been working together for a long time. We agree on many things, but we're great collaborators because we're also very different. And we point this out in the preface to our book. Brad is happily married with a large interracial family. He is religious. I am an unmarried secular liberal. And so we disagree about many things, but we agree about them enough that we can find some common ground. So yeah, Brad and I don't.
Okay. So, I mean, definitely. Well, I want to thank Nick for being on today, guys. And yeah, I will definitely link you guys to some of his work. If I'll ask him for some of his books afterwards. I'll have those in the description, as well as any other information he provides. I will say, please do not send him nasty emails. Do not harass him after this. Do not go after him in any way. Thank you. Gracious enough to come on. Yeah. So if you have any questions for him, please ask them in the comment section. Yeah. And think about it carefully. If you ask polite questions, he's more likely to respond to your polite questions versus nasty comments. Yeah. Your free it
always amuses me to be told I look like Pauly Shore, NET. That always, I've been getting that for decades. Such beautiful hair.
So guys, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MGTOW or death. And cheers.